Hey, Bill Watson here. Hope you're enjoying these podcasted Bible studies that we've arranged to conduct. You know, the Church of God International has always intended to try to utilize as much of the technology that we have and different methods and tactics that it provides to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And podcasting is really a very valid and legitimate method in utilizing the technologies that are at our disposal. However, podcasting does have its limitations, as you well know. Unlike webcasting, you can't really interact in real time. So what we've done, we've made arrangements whereby you can ask questions or make comments and send them to us via email. That's right, all you've got to do is go ahead and email us at billw@cgi.org, and hopefully this is going to enhance the educational value of the subject that we're covering as we go through the topics in a more specific way, being directed by your questions and your comments. So let's go ahead now, prepare to go back into the book that we're studying, and we'll look forward to your comments and questions. Just email us. Remember, email us at billw@cgi.org. So we are going to pick up now on Daniel chapter 2, and this is part 3. Actually, this is the second session of Daniel 2 that we've been on and in, and we were back on this in December. Then, of course, I was gone, so we're picking up on where we left off with regard to that. I want to remind all of us that this is a very pivotal book. The book of Daniel is a very pivotal book, and it actually draws lines in the sand prophetically. Because from this point on, as I've been reiterating here to all of you, the end times, latter days are outlined, and clarity begins now to come into play as to what we can expect generations down the road on how this all plays out on the world scene. All the kingdoms prior to this, remember, all the kingdoms prior to this were kingdoms that led up to finally what we call this pivotal book and prophet, Daniel, who does indeed tie in to Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. I'm not going to turn there right now, but we will see that the book of Daniel does indeed connect up with Revelation 13 and Revelation 17 in a very sequential fashion, and uniquely enough, validates what we're actually reading here, because keep in mind, when John received the book of Revelation, he received it in around 90 AD, or 90 CE, the current era. This was written in about 600 BC, or BCE, before the current era. So with that being said, the fact of it is that you've got about a 700-year period of time that has gone by when John comes on the scene talking about the same thing. Now, the unique thing about this, and we're going to see this played out in the second portion of this prophecy in the book of Daniel, because remember, in Daniel 2, where we are located, this is the first of two pivotal prophecies in the book of Daniel, that all these two in the book of Daniel do link up with Revelation 13 and 17 as well. And where I was going with what I was about to say before is this first one, keep in mind, came from God to a Gentile king. And the Gentile king was actually used as the conduit to share end-time prophecies. Now, you'll see the second time this end-time vision is brought to Daniel, it actually is not from a Gentile, it's actually a vision directly given to Daniel, as is a vision directly given to John the Apostle. So that'll be later on, as you'll see, but the point of it is that I wanted to make here is this is unique in the sense that a Gentile king is being used actually to bring this information to the surface and to begin to provide substance by which the end-time, latter-day prophecies are now begin to become identified. And so we see that here in Daniel chapter 2 via a dream that Nebuchadnezzar was given, king of Babylon, and of which we read about the last time back in early December with respect to the earlier verses of chapter 2 that took us from verse 1 through 35, because we're going to pick up here in verse 36 here in a moment of chapter 2 of the book of Daniel. But in chapter 2, verses 1 through 35, just to kind of thumbnail sketch the situation, we have a dream that was given to Nebuchadnezzar, Gentile king, who then takes this dream and puts out an edict, a request actually, to the area of Babylon to ask for individuals that would indeed be able to interpret the dream. He didn't want to tell the dream, and actually claims he forgot the dream, and was looking for somebody not only to tell him what the dream meant, but to also tell him what the dream was. And make a long story short, without belaboring a lot of the details, we understand that Daniel was given the insight along with his buddies, because he took the challenge up after he found out that Nebuchadnezzar was going to kill all of the seers and the wise men in Babylon if they couldn't come to some kind of determination on what that dream was all about. So with that being said, the fact remains is that Daniel got involved, and we understand here in verse 16, he goes in, desired of the king that he would give him a time that he would show the king the interpretation thereof. And so Daniel wanted some time, he bought some time. Daniel was indeed given insight into the dream and was given the knowledge of what the dream was all about. And we understand then, in breaking into the context here, of essentially what the dream consisted of. And let's just kind of overlap where we basically ended last time to where we'll go forward from here, and that is in verse 31. And in verse 31 we read this, you kings saw and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before you, and the form thereof was terrible. And so Nebuchadnezzar, and he admitted he was bothered by the dream. It disturbed him. I mean, he knew that this was a dream that really was not a comfortable dream. It wasn't a happy dream. It was kind of nightmarish as far as he was concerned in its orientation. And so Daniel now proceeds, and he says, the image's head, verse 32, was of fine gold, his breasts and arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part of iron and part of clay. You saw till that a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon its feet. So you see this stone coming down, and it hits the feet of the image where the clay and the iron had been, because remember, the toes were made out of iron and clay. It smites the image upon its feet, verse 34, that were of iron and clay, and broke it in pieces. Verse 35 now. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So this stone, whatever it represented, hit the image, destroyed the image. The bits and the pieces and the materials of what the image was made of was blown to the wind. It just basically diminished and vaporized. It was totally destroyed. And the stone then proceeded to fill the earth, the whole earth, it says, a great mountain, and filled the whole earth. It turned into a mountain. So verse 36 now, all of that was very symbolic. If you just take that for what it's worth, you would say your guess is as good as mine, because we really have no bearing on what any of that represents other than what it actually was, and that was the head of gold, and the breast of silver and arms and so on, iron and clay and what have you. So in verse 36, we now start to come to the interpretation, and Daniel says, this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation thereof before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings. Now this is very important. Daniel's going to lay it down, a very important premise here. He says, you, O king, are a king of kings. In other words, Babylon is considered by God a superior ruling empire, and for all intents and purposes is one of four that are going to be considered of the same scope and scale going further in history. So the premise is laid that this is as far as God is concerned at the time, a world ruling, even though it was more regionally located over there in the Iraqi, Afghanistan general vicinity of that territory, Syria, that area there. The fact of it was, in God's eyes at this time, predicated on the situation of mankind and the history of this Babylonian kingdom was considered superior to all other kingdoms, and God states he, Nebuchadnezzar, was a king of kings. Small k, of course, but king of kings nevertheless. Now, another important point right here, next on the other side of that colon. For the God of heaven has given you, that's Nebuchadnezzar, a kingdom, power, and strength and glory. So Daniel lays down a premise here, makes it very clear to Nebuchadnezzar, and this is going to come into play later on, as you will see how important it comes into play in terms of the fact of why God takes the action, the punitive action, against Nebuchadnezzar later. But we won't go there yet. I don't want to get ahead of myself. My point is, though, Daniel is laying down this fact, and the fact is, God gave Nebuchadnezzar the position. God rules in the realm of man. He sets up kings and takes them down. He sets up empires and takes them down. And so Daniel was laying the very fact of this premise to Nebuchadnezzar, clearly identifying that Nebuchadnezzar was king of kings by allowance of God. By the allowance of God. That's important to keep in mind. Sadly, as you'll see, Nebuchadnezzar forgets that point later on, but that's another story. We'll get to it in a little bit here. Verse 38, and wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and the fowls of heaven, has he, God, given into your, Nebuchadnezzar, your hand. So he reestablishes not only the land, not only the kingdom and the power and the strength, but all of the beasts of the field and the fowls of the heaven, and including the children of men in the kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar, you are king of kings, and you have the right to rule all of not only the land and the territory, but the things in the territory, including the animals. You want to go safari hunting? You can do it. You want to kill a cow or whatever? You can do it. You've got full control of the people, the animals, the birds, everything. You are the man, basically. But again, Daniel reiterates, because God gave it to him, and has made you ruler, still verse 38, over them all. And then Daniel says this emphatically, you are this head of gold. Wham. So now we're beginning to get some identity. We're getting context. We're now beginning to understand this image is not only being identified as the head of gold being associated with Babylon, but it says something even more importantly. What it says to us now is the image represents a metaphor. It represents an allegoric story of representing kingdoms. Kingdoms deal with people, territory, laws, and of course rulers, kings. And so we see that the head of gold was figuratively the kingdom of Babylon. Now look at this, verse 39, it becomes even clearer. And after you, that is Nebuchadnezzar, after Babylon, which is telling also Nebuchadnezzar that Babylon is going to have a finite time. It's going to be basically ending at some point. Because he says here, after you, meaning of course you're going to end, shall arise another kingdom. So now we know we're talking about kingdoms. We're talking about people. We're talking about kings, rulers. We're talking about territories and laws. We're talking about intrinsic things in real live time on planet Earth. So he says here, kingdom, inferior though to Babylon. And another, a third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth. So it's going to be equivalent in scope and scale as Babylon, but it's not going to be of the same caliber. It's not going to be of the same type of strength and value. Each kingdom you see begins to degrade in its material value, illustrating that even though the scope and scale as far as territory is concerned seems to match the scale and scope of Babylon, the fact of it is the value of it, the quality of that kingdom, what it provides in terms of quality of life and so on, is less than what Babylon provided. And so here we see this demonstrated and explained in the degradation of the materials that were being told. And then in verse 40, he says this, "And the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, for as much as iron breaks in pieces and subdues all things, and as iron that breaks all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise." So now we have a fourth kingdom, which is really just brute strong. I mean, it's just brutally strong, and it does indeed go and break in pieces a lot of things, but it's just really brutish. It's more or less what you could say very tyrannical in its notion here that we're being given in verse 40. Now, verse 41, it goes on here now. "And whereas you saw the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part iron, the kingdom shall be divided. But there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as you saw the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken, or partly brittle." Hebrew could be also brittle. So here we see a couple of parts here. We've got, of course, what we were told as being part of the iron was his legs of iron and his feet part of iron and part of clay. So you've got two parts of the body. The legs are iron, strictly iron, and that's what pops up first. And then later on, the toes or the feet are part iron and clay. So it's weaker, but there's more parts to it, more digits. There's 10 of them. There's 10 digits, 10 toes that are made of clay and iron. Now, all this has meaning and all of this has significance as we go forward here. However, with that being said, up to this point, from 39 to 42, we don't have an idea of what in the world Daniel's interpreting here. The only thing that Daniel really makes crystal clear to us at this point in the interpretation is that Nebuchadnezzar was the king of gold, or the head of gold, and Babylon was the head of gold. So that we've got 2020, and therefore gives context to the following kingdoms that follow, of which the fourth one represents two components of the body, the legs and the toes. The others represented only one part or component of the body, and they came and they went, they came and they went. But keep in mind that iron and clay represents a merging of a continuation of this fourth kingdom that will not necessarily be identified here at this point yet. He goes here in verse 43 and says, "Whereas you saw iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." So we're told that this last phase of this iron and clay kingdom is going to be mixed with the seeds of men, which is easily understood to be probably multiracial, multi-ethnical, multicultural. It's going to be mixed with seeds of men, so it will have different ethnicities mixed with each other. That is a very easy notion to get from that, as well as they will be somewhat unassimilated. They won't assimilate too well. There's going to be some friction between them, because we read here that they shall not cleave one to another. It shall not really mix real well. The assimilation will be somewhat limited. However, verse 44, in the days of these kings, wait a minute. So we were just told an interpretation here. The kings, in the days of these kings, what kings? We didn't hear of any kings, except we've got this notion that the toes, these toes on the feet, may represent kings. Because when Daniel says the days of these kings, he doesn't really identify them with the toes. However, later on, you're going to see these are validated by other individuals, namely Daniel himself from his own vision, and John the Apostle 700 years later in Revelation 13 and 17, from a vision he got directly from Christ, who was giving him visions, and which comes back and validates Daniel, his vision, which you're going to see here in chapter 7 when we get to it, and this dream of a Gentile king, Nebuchadnezzar, which overlays on, and I'll go backwards now, Daniel 7's vision to Daniel, and the vision and prophecies that were given to John via the angel. So they all mingle together. All three, be it the dream and the two visions, one to Daniel and one to John, and the dream, of course, to Nebuchadnezzar. And here we're told, in the days of these kings, and you're left to assume, well, it must be these toes. I mean, it says kings, plural. It says kings, plural. So, we're down to the last portion of that part of the body, that segment of the body. It says here, shall the king of heaven set up a kingdom, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all other kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter. So what Daniel is saying is, here's the whole 10 yards. The 10 yards are, there's kingdoms coming after you, Nebuchadnezzar. There's going to be basically a second, a third, and a fourth. 3 other kingdoms. The fourth kingdom is going to have quite an extension, because it's going to last all the way to the return of Christ. Isn't that what it said? It said 10 in the days of those 10 kings. In the days of those 10 kings, it says here, the God of heaven, verse 44, will set up his kingdom, which shall never be destroyed. So there's going to be 10 kings at the end, most likely because the last material was mentioned was made of clay and iron that were connected to the iron, but was infiltrated by the clay due to the intermingling of the seeds of men. That's what we read. So you begin to put all this together to see this picture of how you're being told what is happening. And obviously, it's easy to claim the fact that the toes that were mixed with iron and clay were an extension of the legs of iron. And why do I say that? Because the iron is still found in the toes. So it's an extension of the iron legs, and consequently connected in that fashion. And then Daniel says this at the end of verse 45, and the dream is certain, the interpretation thereof sure. And notice what Nebuchadnezzar does in verse 46. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, falls on his face and worshiped Daniel and commanded that he should offer an oblation and a sweet odor unto him. In other words, make a sacrifice unto Daniel. The king was so moved by virtue of the way Daniel said what he said. And what did Daniel say again? And the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof is sure. I don't know what the tone of voice was. I don't know how Daniel looked at Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know eye contact, body language, whatever. But it caused Nebuchadnezzar basically to go cold. He completely, and I mean, you're going to get to meet Nebuchadnezzar in ways that you're going to see this guy was a maniac. I mean, he was a narcissist to the max. The guy was in love with himself. He himself got so distorted in his own sense of importance that he began to think he himself was a god. And for him to do this and to literally fall on his face and essentially perform an oblation to Daniel, a Jew, and a captive at that, was just amazing. I mean, frankly, was unheard of in that respect, and certainly something to behold for Nebuchadnezzar to take that kind of posture after Daniel said that. And I got to thinking, about, what would Daniel have said, and how does that make us feel? I remember a couple of times in the course of my life where I have had somebody really affirmatively tell me something. I remember one time I was working for a company, and they said, Bill, we're downsizing, we're going to let you go. And I was actually thinking I was going in for an increase in my salary, thinking I was going to actually get a merit raise. I was of that mind because my sales were top of all the salespeople, so I thought there's no way, that this, I thought this was going to be a nice meeting. And I walked in there, and lo and behold, they flat out told me that, guess what, and very affirmatively, you're being laid off. Not fired, laid off. We're downsizing, and we're laying you off, so go collect unemployment. And that made me go cold. I mean, I wasn't about to bow down and make oblations to him, but my point is, in principle, it was affirmative. There was no like, wow, what's the B plan on this? It was just, that was it. It was final. There was no going back about it. And I don't know how Daniel said what he said, but whatever he said it very affirmatively, so much so that Nebuchadnezzar was convinced Daniel had this 20/20. Because remember, the only way Nebuchadnezzar was able to affirm what Daniel was saying was true is that Daniel had the right imagery associated with the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. However, Nebuchadnezzar said he forgot it, which means that apparently he must have remembered it from the standpoint of the fact that how Daniel was talking, and consequently perhaps bringing his memory back to identify with what Daniel was indeed talking about. And so the king falls down. He concedes to Daniel's authority and an affirmation of what he dreamt. And the king answered, verse 47, unto Daniel, and he said, of a truth it is, your God is a God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets, seeing you couldst reveal this secret, meaning you could do it. You revealed the secret. So no one could have done this without you being truly a servant of the God of gods. So the king made Daniel a great man, verse 48, gave him many great gifts, made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief of the governors over all the wise men of Babylon. So all the guys that were going to be killed, all the guys that Nebuchadnezzar was going to bring in to ask them, or did bring in and ask them, what did he dream? All of those guys, Daniel now was ruling over them. Daniel was their boss. They had to answer to Daniel. He was given the authority to run that whole section of Babylon's operation. And here Daniel, in all of that praise and that accolade, he says in 49, requests the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So they were made governors. His three buddies were made actually governors of affairs that were going on in the province of Babylon. So they were like judges and magistrates. They were legislators of sort that worked within the governing legislative body of Babylon and had authority to make and or break decisions. But Daniel, it says here in the latter part of 49, sat in the gate of the king. He was essentially ruler over all. Daniel was very high up in the government pecking order, and consequently was given a lot of authority and was viewed very respectfully. And this was very uncommon. Most scholars, most of the archaeological finds and so on illustrate the fact, and this is important to recognize, that these kinds of positions were reserved for citizens of the Chaldeans. You didn't see Jews or POWs, people that were, basically prisoners of war, getting these kinds of positions. You talk about immigration issues. This would have been a maximum of the people of Babylon saying, "What? What's going on? How did he do that?" But you can't argue with results in lieu of the fact that Daniel was able to interpret that dream, which certainly made it appear as though he had something special that all those other seers and wise men didn't really have in terms of gifts and powers. So here we see this event occurring, and Daniel and his three buddies set up in a pretty sweet position of authority, leadership, and set for pretty much a good life in Babylon. Now, time passes. Chapter 3. Most commentaries will tell you that the years between chapter 2 and chapter 3 is about 20, about 2 decades. 20 years passed. And Nebuchadnezzar, the king, gets a wild idea. He's going to make an image of gold. Many of the commentators claim that perhaps he, after 20 years, was thinking back on that dream that he had and what Daniel had told him and what he was feeling and so on, and maybe nostalgia or whatever, but some have implied and made the innuendo that maybe this image of gold came out of that memory. At any rate, he makes it a height of 60 cubits, that's 60, 60 cubits, and the breadth, the width, was 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, depending on how and which cubit you use, it could be anywhere from 12 inches to 18 inches. Normally, when they used to measure a cubit, it was from the elbow to the tip of the hand. That was a cubit. But in most cases, your commentaries will tell you that this statue was probably somewhere around, using the 18-inch cubit, about 90 feet high and approximately 9 feet wide. And so I think that door would probably be, what do you think, 6 feet wide? Maybe 6 feet? I don't know. But 7 feet to the doorway. Doors are 7 feet. Add another 2. That's how wide it was. And then 90 feet high. And this wouldn't be uncommon for some of the statues of the day, because the Belus Temple had a 40-cubit high statue, and the Colossus of Rhodes was 70 cubits. So this being 90 was no big deal. Most scholars, though, will tell you that it probably wasn't a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, because the kings of Babylon didn't necessarily make statues of themselves. However, it probably was a statue of a human of some sort, a human body, knowing that it was from Babylon because of the archaeological finds of other statues they found. But most likely was somewhat of probably one of the gods of Babylon, like Nabu, or perhaps even Zeus, whereby these were the gods of Babylon, and making a statue of that sort, Nebuchadnezzar decided that he wanted to have it in the area of Dura, which was about 6 miles outside of the city of Babylon, southeast actually of Babylon. It wasn't either solid gold. That would have been too much. Most of the statues that have been found in Babylon were gold-leafed. They were plated with gold. They were made of wood, but then they were covered in gold. Thin gold, I don't have any thickness of it, but most cases, most of the statues were made of wood framing, and then they leafed and embedded gold overlaid gold on the wood frame. So in this particular case, though, it was laid out and erected over at Dura, which was, like I said, about 6 miles southeast of Babylon. And some of the historians that I'm referencing here, Pliny and Herodotus, who confirmed that many of the statues, like I said, are made out of wood and gold overlaid. It was probably, as I mentioned, a human form, and was probably exemplified or modeled after something like Zeus, that he would have made it to look. But the point of it is here, in verse 2, he says that the king sent to gather together the princes and governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers and the counselors, this is chapter 3, verse 2, the sheriffs and all the rulers of the provinces. Oh boy, there goes Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. They got caught up in this dragnet. They got caught up because they were rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication. So all the leaders, all the governors, all the top dogs in the political arenas were invited to come down to this great event that Nebuchadnezzar was undertaking and conducting. Verse 3, the princes and the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together under the dedication of the image of Nebuchadnezzar, the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar set up. Verse 4 now, then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you will fall and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. So this is the event. They're calling all these people down. They've got bands there. They've got a big to-do. It's a big event. Everybody's invited, and they're going to unveil this statue that's 90 feet high by roughly 9 foot wide. And all the leaders are going to be there. And when you hear the music, Nebuchadnezzar is expecting you to prostrate yourself on the ground, bowing to this image, to this statue. Verse 6, and whoso falls not down and worships shall the same hour be cast in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Oh boy. So that's the consequence. If you don't do this, you're going to be burned alive in a furnace. I've often thought, many times, I used to work down in the steel mills over at the 98-inch hot mill where they used to make Army tanks for World War II. Down at, back then it was called Republic Steel. Many people called it Repulsive Steel, but that's another story. Steve knows what I'm talking about. But at any rate, they had these big hot furnaces where you'd put these slabs in, and they'd heat them up, and they'd then get them so hot that they would then stretch them out in these rollers that look like taffy and make coils, and then put them on flatbed trucks or trains and haul them off and make refrigerators or cars out of them, at some auto plant or some appliance factory. But the fact of it was, I always remembered, I'd look in those furnaces and I would be reminded of these furnaces, burning, and seeing how hot it would get that steel and those slabs in there to get them so soft that they could stretch them like taffy and make coils out of them. But at any rate, he says here, therefore, verse 7, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations and languages, fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king set up. Wherefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. So there were some Jews that didn't do this. And needless to say, we're going to focus on some particular ones in this case, which happen to be Daniel's 3 buddies specifically, and they get squealed on. And the Chaldeans bring it to the attention of Nebuchadnezzar. They spoke and they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Verse 10 now. You, O king, have made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and the dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falls not down and worships, that he should be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Well, verse 13 or 12. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the provinces. These leaders, these Jews, we're going to get them because these guys Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego need to be held accountable because they did not bow down. And that's what they're going to be accused of here, because he says, whom you set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded you. They serve not your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. And this indication lends to the commentators of why they don't believe Nebuchadnezzar made a statue of himself. Because it says here that they did not regard you, they serve not your gods, meaning they were wanting to bow down to the gods of Babylon, and of which many commentators use that and leverage it to illustrate that that's why they doubt the statue was really a statue of Nebuchadnezzar, but rather perhaps Zeus or Nebu or somebody like that. But at any rate, it goes on here in verse 13 that Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Now stop and think about this. This is, 20 years ago. Okay, 20 years ago. Think of somebody maybe you haven't seen in 20 years. Or think of somebody that you know, rather, think of somebody that you do know for 20 years and that you've had interaction with because they've been pretty close to you. As a matter of fact, you've been working with them because they've been leaders of provinces. King Nebuchadnezzar was the consistent king all those 20 years. So there's no doubt in my mind anyway that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew Nebuchadnezzar. That Nebuchadnezzar and those three boys, or men now, for all intents and purposes, had probably an ongoing relationship with each other. He knew them. And 20 years ago when they were teenagers, because remember, we talked about Daniel, the age, and how old they probably were when they were taken to Babylon on the first invasion. Remember, they were taken on the first, Ezekiel was taken on the third. But that being what said, the fact of it was, he, Nebuchadnezzar, knew these guys since they were teens. 17, 18, 16, I don't know, 15 maybe. But the point of it is now, 20 years later, they're in their 30s, mid-30s, late 30s, early 30s, whatever. The fact is, he is mad at him. He's outraged at him. He is livid with them. And yet, they've been working in the government. They've been serving the people of Babylon, making decisions, as magistrates and doing all the legislative work that they were required to do as leaders of the provinces of Babylon in the affairs. Verse 49, look at that, chapter 2, verse 49, over the affairs of the province of Babylon. That's what Daniel was able to get and request of the king so that the king inserted them, installed them into those roles and positions. So these were not unknown people. They were well known by Nebuchadnezzar. And so it goes on here in verse 13, so then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commands the three guys to be brought to him. Then they brought these men before the king. Okay, verse 14 now. Nebuchadnezzar, verse 14, says to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not you serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? What are you doing? Is this true? He calls them down on it. What's wrong with you guys? Verse 15. Now, if you be ready, so he's going to give them a chance. He's going to give them a second chance. He says, now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I've made. But if you worship not, you shall be cast into the same hour. That same hour I'm going to throw you into the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Whoa. What? So soon we forget? You see what I'm saying? So soon we forget? Who's going to deliver you out of the hands? What God is going to deliver you out of my hand? Don't you know I got the power over you? I mean, just look at over chapter 2. Let's go back in verse 46. The king fell on his face, worshiped Daniel, offered an oblation. The king answered. The king spoke, verse 47, chapter 2, Daniel, unto Daniel, and says, of a truth, it is your God, capital G, is a God, capital G, of gods, small g. and Lord, capital L, of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing you could reveal this secret. I mean, he was contrite. He was shook up. He was taken right off of his feet. He was humbled. He made concessions. He fell prostrate on his face and actually offered offerings, worshiped Daniel in that respect. Amazing. 20 years later, he has the audacity to say that if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour in the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God, capital G, that shall deliver you out of my hands? So it's almost as though he knew who he was challenging and essentially facing off with. It was almost like, I've got control here, and I'm going to do as I please with these three guys. Try to stop me, kind of a thing. I mean, it says capital G. There was no doubt in his mind who he's challenging in this particular case as he remembers what was going on. And so, verse 16 here, verse 16, we'll continue on. He says, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego answer and says to the king, and this is one of my favorite parts of the Bible. This is one of my favorite parts. I mean, you can see those three guys, 35 years old, 32, 38, whatever, how old they were. They probably weren't 40, though, probably in their mid-30s, standing there in front of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, by this time, who knows? He may have been 60, maybe 70 years old, and, king of whatever he thought he was the king of. And he says here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. In other words, we have no need to address you with what you just said. In other words, they might say, in another way, it's better if we didn't really answer you, Nebuchadnezzar, and maybe even add to this, for your own sake. Because in all due respect, Nebuchadnezzar was in essence, fisting. He was fisting to God, basically with these three guys claiming that God had nothing to do, or could not override what he was about to do to these three young men. Verse 17. But he goes on here and he says, verse 17, if it be our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, this is one of my favorite scriptures right here, O king, that we will not serve your gods nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Wow. They just dug in. They said, look, if our God does deliver us, you're not going to stop him. But if he doesn't, guess what? We're still not bowing down. Have your way with us. That goes back to the sermon we were talking about today with building faith. These guys were loaded with faith. They knew exactly where they were in reality, and that reality included their relationship with God. They were in partnership with God. They knew that if God chose to glorify himself through protecting them, so be it. But if not, they're okay with that too. They're okay with that. And that's a place in our walk with Christ that all of us need to aspire to get to, whereby we are that confident to be able to concede to the either-or result, the either-or consequence. The king got upset. Oh boy, he was full of fury in verse 19, and the form of his visage changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore, he spoke and he commanded, heat the fire up 7 times more than it was to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their coats, their hosens, and their hats, their mantles, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of their burning fiery furnace. They were actually in their garb of leadership. Therefore, because the king's commandment was so urgent, and the furnace exceedingly so hot, the flame of the fire actually slew the men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was that hot. I remember years ago when I used to, again, going back to the steel mill, I have we used to run stainless, and it was so hot it was transparent. The coils, when you banded them, they would coil down on the floor. You know what I'm talking about, Stephen. They would coil down. And the stainless steel was so hot that when the coil came up like a Tootsie Roll and went on the conveyor, then I had to loop it with a machine, and I was covered in asbestos, I think it is, and I had a face guard and all of that, and I'd have to loop it, and I had this little machine, and it would hit it and bring the loop, the band real tight, and then I'd hit it, and it would cut it. And then the next one would come, and I'd do the same thing. But when the stainless was being run, we could only work 10 to 15 minutes on, 45 minutes off, because we sweated so much. And I could literally smell my hair burning and singeing from my eyebrows and on top of my hair because it was so hot. And I could actually see 6 or so inches into the coil. It was transparent, it was so hot. That's how hot it was. And amazing. And so these guys, this fiery furnace was hot because it killed the guys that threw these 3 fellows into the furnace. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Can you imagine this? Just picture this for a moment. These 3 guys, they get thrown in, and they're on the ground in the fiery furnace. Flames are going all over them, and they're all bound up, roped and tied, and like, dead body wrapped in a body bag of some sort. And they're all, roped and tied in there, and they're on the ground, laying there like a bunch of hot dogs. And he says here, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste and spoke and said to his counselors, did not we cast 3 bound men into the fire? And they answered, and they said unto the king, true, O king. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Wow. What a miraculous event here that we're witnessing and being told about. Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace. He couldn't believe his eyes. He came near to the fiery furnace, not real close, I'm sure, because the other guys were burned when they threw the bodies in. And he spoke, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come forth, come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. Verse 27 now. This is amazing. And the princes, the governors, the captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, and he said, he goes back 20 years. Boy, what a short memory. It's amazing, this guy. He says, then Nebuchadnezzar spoke, verse 28, and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So here you have an ending to a good story, but once more, Nebuchadnezzar having to be basically slapped in the face and told, look, You've got to stop acting that way. And this is now another major event in Nebuchadnezzar's life that God, the God of the Bible, God of heaven, as Daniel pointed out there in chapter 2, where he, the God of the Bible, stated that, look, I am the God of gods, and you need to respect that and understand that, there is no other God like me. And challenging me like that is really out of order. Now, from this point on, in chapter 4, we have a whole new situation developing. We're going to stop here, though, and put chapter 4 at another time. But suffice it to say, Nebuchadnezzar, you're going to find, is still having a hard time learning his lesson as we go along in this scenario here. But we'll get into more of those details a little bit later. But you would think, after seeing some of these things, all I'd have to do is see one of those things in my life. And, I would hope to remember that throughout the course of the remainder of my life, depending, of course, on circumstance, situation. But I'd like to think that I'd be fixed for life in believing that, you don't challenge this God of gods that Daniel